Hi friends, this is Shekhar Srinivasan for csharp.netprogrammers.com. In this video, I will be explaining about ADO.NET. So what does ADO.NET means? It is a technology or a framework which is used for developing a .NET application to interact with any database or XML documents. So whenever we have a requirement for interacting with a database through any .NET application, maybe a desktop application or maybe a web application which is developed using C# or VB.NET or any language, if we have a requirement to interact with the database or XML, we can use ADO.NET. When we say ADO.NET, it supports two types of models. One we call it as disconnected model. The other one we call it as connection oriented model. These are the two models what we have. When I say ADO.NET disconnected model, if we use this model, then we don't have to maintain the connectivity between an application and the database. This model have a capability to establish the connectivity and closes the connection as per the requirement. Now let's try to understand the architecture of ADO.NET in a simple terms. To start with this, say that we have a application. This may be any .NET application developed using any language, and my requirement is to interact with the database. When I say that I have a requirement such that a .NET application has to interact with the database, then directly an application cannot interact with the database. If we wanted to interact with the database, we take the support of ADO.NET. When I say ADO.NET disconnected model, then we have been provided with some kind of managed data providers. So the data providers to support disconnected model are, we have something called as a connection, which establish the physical connectivity with the database. So through connection, we try to interact with the database. We just specify which database we want to interact. Do you want to use a SQL Server database, or do we have to use a Oracle database or MS Access or Excel worksheets? With the connection, we can mention. Then we have been provided with something called as a data adapter, where a data adapter uses the connection. Okay, data adapter uses the connection. A data adapter can be considered as a collection of command objects which will help in interacting with the databases. Now, my adapter cannot interact with the application directly, and hence what we do is we take the support of data set. The data adapter fills the data set such that the data will be maintained within the data set. And once the adapter provides the information to the data set, my data set can interact with the application. But whenever we have a requirement such that I wanted to provide the data by filtering using various conditions, or I wanted to sort the data frequently based on various sort expressions, or if I wanted to project the data in page wise, or if I want to support navigations, then we can take the support of data view, where data view can be considered as a logical representation of the table present within the data set. And this data view can also be binded with the application. When we try to observe the disconnected model, the application, data view and data set, these three things will exist at the client system. Now let's try to understand in detail what is connection, adapter, data set and data view. When we say something called as a connection, I already mentioned that connection is used to establish the physical connectivity between the application and database. Now, when I say a data adapter is going to be a collection of command objects which is used for interacting between the database and dataset. Now let's try to observe in detail what is data adapter. I already informed that a data adapter is a collection of command objects which acts like a interface or bridge between the database and the data set for transferring the data. Now let me just try to clearly explain what is the meaning of my statements. Say that we have an application and my requirement is this application has to interact with the database. But the problem is an application cannot interact with the database. If we say my application, if you can recollect the architecture, my application interacts with a person with a name called as dataset. But the problem is the dataset cannot interact with the database. But whatever the information I am going to provide through my application, it gets collected to the dataset, and my dataset cannot interact with the database. And if any information is present within the database, I am not able to get it to the dataset because dataset cannot interact with the database. And since your application and dataset can't interact with the database, I have some requirements such that whatever the information present within the database, I should able to provide it to the dataset. The information present within the dataset, I need to pass it to the database. So I require some kind of bridge between the dataset and database for transferring the data. So the bridge between the data set and database can be treated as your data adapter. A data adapter is going to be a collection of command objects which is used as a bridge between the database and the data set for transferring the data. When I try to pass the information from the database to the data set, we call that as fill. And whenever we try to pass the information from the data set to the database, we call it as update. So we can just assume that a data adapter is going to be a collection of commands, objects, which acts like a bridge between the database and the data set for transferring the data. Now when I just try to check out what are the objects present within the data adapter, we have some objects called as select command. We have some object, or you can say the command objects, table mappings, insert command, update command, these are the command objects belongs to our data adapter. So a data adapter is going to be a collection of command objects which is going to be acting as a bridge between the data set and the database. Now let's try to understand the data set. We can just assume that a data set as an in-memory representation of the data on the client system in the format of XML. Whatever the information that we try to store within the data set, it gets maintained on the client system within some memory block in the format of XML. When we try to observe the data set, there are certain points we have to remember. A data set can maintain the information about any number of tables irrespective of the database. One table may be from a SQL server. If I want, I can even get the data from another database. Any number of tables we can just maintain within the data set. Data set also supports establishing the relationship between the data tables. Data set, if you try to perform any kind of manipulations, those manipulations will not be reflected on the database. So these are the 3 points we have to remember about data set. A data set can maintain any number of data tables. Data relations can also be maintained within the data tables of data set. And if you perform any kind of manipulations on the data set, those manipulations will not be reflected on the database. So if I just try to observe the data set properly, I can just assume that a data set is going to be a collection of data tables. We can just assume that a data set is going to be a collection of data tables. It can also maintain some XML schema information. Dataset also supports data relations. So when we try to observe the data set, a data set can consist of a collection of data tables, XML schema and data relations. When I just try to observe a data table, or we can also call with a name called as data member. We can call it as a data table or data member. When I just try to observe this data table, it can consist of a collection of data rows. It can consist of a collection of data rows, data columns, and constraints. So we can just assume that a data set is a collection of data tables, XML schema and data relations, where a data table can be a collection of data rows, data columns and constraints. When we try to understand the data set, we can categorize the data set into two categories. First one, we call it as a typed data set. When I say a typed data set, then if the data set is defined based on XML schema definition, then we call it as a typed data set. When we use a typed data set, the data tables will be available at the design time. So we can refer the tables and its columns directly while writing the programs. I will be explaining more in detail about what is typed data set, how to access it programmatically. But as of now, just try to understand. When we say a typed data set, it maintains the information based on some XML schema definition file. The other one we call it as an untyped data set, where an untyped data set is defined based on a dataset object without depending upon an XML schema definition. Untyped dataset members will be available at the runtime and they will be executed faster than a typed dataset. Both these models we will understand practically in detail once I start with my demos on ADO.NET. As of now, just try to understand a dataset is an in-memory representation of the data in the client system in the format of XML. A dataset is of two types. One we call it as typed dataset, the other one we call it as untyped dataset. A dataset can maintain the information about any number of tables. It can also maintain the data relations, and if any manipulations are performed, those manipulations will not be reflected on the database. Now, when we use something called as a data view, data view can be considered as a logical representation of the data present within the data tables of dataset. Data view, you can use it when you say that we have a requirement such that frequently we want to sort the data, and based on various conditions we want to filter the data, or we wanted to project the data in navigation order or page wise. Then we use the data view. Hope you are clear with the ADO.NET disconnected model. In the next video, I will try to explain in detail about ADO.NET connection oriented model, and we will try to understand when to use ADO.NET disconnected model and connection oriented model. If you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This encourages me to develop more and more videos. Thank you, yours Shekhar.